Hey everyone, as you may or may not be aware of, a few months ago, Graham Hancock, a major advocate of pseudo-archaeological claims, most notably an Ice Age civilization that collapsed at the end of the Pleistocene, debated the archaeologist Flint Dibble. This was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and in this video, I want to give my thoughts on some key points made in the debate. One thing Flint started with was noting that archaeology isn't just about digging up artifacts at X location from Y time. Now, we have big data archaeology, where we can see trends that span different regions over the course of centuries or even millennia. And this is important because many people who are well versed in history tend to view ancient civilizations and cultures in isolation, when in reality, they were part of an interconnected network and were influenced by regional trends. Later, Joe Rogan asked, "Aren't there still people living like they did during the Stone Age now?" But I would argue that they aren't, because while there are some tribes in the Amazon who on the surface live a similar lifestyle, they have been trading with people from industrialized society. Now, you could argue that uncontacted tribes like those on North Sentinel Island would be living like they did in the Stone Age, but I would say they're not. Remember, Ice Age cultures were part of regional trade networks, and if a tribe is isolated, they aren't part of a trade network. Now, as for Graham's lost civilization, he's argued that the traces of his civilization haven't been found because it was on areas of the continental shelf that were exposed during the Ice Age, but are underwater now. Then, Flint pointed out that we have done extensive underwater archaeology, and what we find is evidence of hunter-gatherers from the Ice Age. Predictably, Graham had stated that we haven't searched all of the continental shelf, i.e. only a small percentage of it, or all the Sahara, or all the Amazon, etc., and that evidence of his lost civilization were in places we have yet to explore. But I would argue that we have a representative sample at this point. To give an analogy, let's say you want to see which politician is the most popular, so you conduct a poll. Your results show that one politician in particular is very popular, but then someone who doesn't like them says, "Well, you didn't poll everyone, you only polled a few thousand people out of millions, so we can't trust your result." Well, of course it's virtually impossible to poll everyone, but if you properly randomized your polling, you would get a representative sample of how the population as a whole feels. So, for Graham to say that we haven't found traces of his civilization because we haven't dredged the entire continental shelf is a throwaway statement if he can't also explain what kind of sampling bias prevented us from finding evidence of his lost civilization. Later on, when Flint reiterated his point about finding traces of hunter-gatherers, Graham said that he's not disputing that there were hunter-gatherers and argued that you could have had both, just as you have people living hunter-gatherer and sedentary lifestyles in places like the Amazon and Namibia now. But the advent of agriculture, along with the division of labor characteristic of civilization, allowed areas to support much higher population densities than they could otherwise. So, while hunter-gatherers have been living in proximity to civilization throughout history, the higher population densities of people living a sedentary lifestyle has left and continues to leave a much larger footprint than contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. So yes, Graham, finding evidence of hunter-gatherers in the Pleistocene, while not finding evidence of civilization, is evidence against an Ice Age civilization. In this case, the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. And this brings me to the next topic, early agriculture. Civilizations didn't spontaneously emerge from hunter-gatherer societies. Instead, they were preceded by thousands of years of development, starting with sedentary lifestyles and agriculture. By the time the first civilizations appeared in Mesopotamia, China, Mexico, Egypt, the Andes, and the Indus Valley, agriculture had spread throughout much of Eurasia, North Africa, and the central part of the Americas. Graham consistently argues that we haven't found evidence of his civilization because it's in understudied areas. Although an area being understudied doesn't preclude us from having a good idea of how people were living there in the ancient past. But if a civilization did emerge in the Ice Age, it would have also have been preceded by the development of agriculture thousands of years earlier, and by the time the first cities came into being, agriculture would have spread across an area the size of a continent, and we'd be finding evidence of it not just in remote areas, but developed areas that have been well studied for over a century. But, on the topic of agriculture, Graham also stated that his civilization introduced agriculture to different hunter-gatherer societies across the globe at the beginning of the Holocene. Now, Flint pointed out that there's a huge problem with this, because where we see agriculture emerging, you see people domesticating locally available plants: wheat in the Near East, corn in Mexico, and rice in China. If agriculture was introduced by the survivors of a civilization that fell at the end of the Ice Age, they would have introduced their own crops. Graham tries to weasel his way out of this by claiming that they introduced the idea of agriculture and taught hunter-gatherers how to domesticate plants. But the problem with this is that people living in the civilizations of classical antiquity and the Bronze Age didn't know how to domesticate crops. They knew how to grow crops that had been domesticated thousands of years earlier. Archaeologists are still debating how the domestication of plants occurred. Why? Because in every case, the domestication of plants preceded writing, so no record of how they were domesticated was kept. People who lived in ancient civilizations thought crops were the gifts of the gods versus wild plants that their ancestors domesticated in the distant past. If you sent a farmer from ancient Egypt 5,000 years in his past to Mexico, how would he know that they should domesticate teosinte, the ancestor of corn? He wouldn't. Another issue Flint brought up was how ideas like Atlantis, or ancient aliens, or any kind of lost civilization were linked to white supremacy. If you want a more detailed description of this, you can watch the video Crackpot Nazi Archaeology by Atunshai Films. But the TLDR is this: when Europeans went out to colonize the rest of the world, they found these fantastic structures which were built by the people whom they considered uncivilized, and one of the key justifications of colonialism was the people in other parts of the world had to be civilized. But if they made all of these structures and monuments, they wouldn't have had to be civilized. So, to be able to keep their justification, various European scholars came up with ideas of how an ancient lost civilization brought the idea of a civilized lifestyle to the people they were trying to colonize. Flint pointed out that Graham had cited various sources from the 19th century, which pushed the idea that indigenous peoples around the world couldn't have developed a civilization on their own, so they had to have been given it by a lost civilization, such as, Atlantis. He said that although he didn't think Graham was a white supremacist, the problem was Graham was citing these sources without critiquing their racist aspects, and was thus reinforcing white supremacy. But, regardless of whether or not Graham critiqued the sources, why would he need to use them in the first place? To give another analogy, let's say an anthropologist was writing a literature review about human evolution. They would never use a publication from the 19th century that argued for eugenics or pushed the idea that some races were more primitive than others. I mean, sure, the publication could have made some valid points that stood the test of time, even though its overall premise was wrong. But if that's the case, since science is repeatable, those points would have been mentioned in other more recent publications. If the 19th century publication made a point that wasn't mentioned in other publications since then, it's a red flag that it was conjured to back its faulty conclusion about racial science. No anthropologist worth their salt would cite it, and for good reason. Although, later on, Graham went on to argue the claim that various Native American gods like Quetzalcoatl were white. Yeah, that's not reinforcing white supremacy at all. If you want a full explanation about how this narrative was conjured up, there's a great video about it by World of Antiquity. Also, Graham tried to distance himself from the more long-standing connections between pseudo-archaeology and white supremacy by saying he doesn't look for traces of a lost civilization in places like Europe, because no civilization would develop in the frozen wastes there, and his civilization was mostly tropical. The reason European civilization hasn't historically been argued to be linked to a lost civilization was because Europeans were supposedly the most civilized people and thus didn't need to be taught civilization. But going back to Graham's claim, there are two problems with this. First, civilizations can develop in harsh environments. I mean, look at the thousands of years of civilization that preceded the Incas in the Andes. Second, Graham often cites the Younger Dryas as the cataclysm that ended his civilization. But the cooling characteristic of the Younger Dryas was most pronounced at the higher latitudes. The tropics were less impacted by it. Graham also cites Sundaland as a prime candidate for the location of his lost civilization, and the Younger Dryas was in the northern hemisphere, so Sundaland wouldn't have been affected by it. Some of the more racist aspects of Graham's ideas sneak in more subtle ways. For example, he talked about how the Olmec heads from Mexico seemed to have African features, and argued that seafarers from Africa could have brought civilization to the region. The Olmecs were the first Mesoamerican civilization. When Flint pointed out the racist aspects of this, Joe asked, how is it reinforcing white supremacy to say that black seafarers brought civilization to Mesoamerica? Well, it's reinforcing the idea that the people of Mesoamerica couldn't have developed civilization on their own, and thus had to be civilized by a colonizer, and those colonizers were Europeans, not Africans. Something I've often heard proponents of prehistoric lost civilizations claim to distance themselves from the racist history of their ideas is, well, we're not saying that the Atlanteans were white. In fact, the racial groups we have today didn't exist during the Pleistocene, but that's another story. The problem is that by arguing that a lost civilization had introduced a civilized lifestyle to different people all over the globe, you're robbing indigenous people of their rich heritage. Another thing I noticed was Graham talked about things like how precisely the pyramids in places like Giza lie to true north, how the Sphinx faced the sun at important times of the year, and how the Egyptians had knowledge of so much astronomical information, and begged the question, where did they get it from? Well, Flint pointed out that if a civilization existed in the Ice Age, it couldn't have been industrial, because atmospheric emissions from industrialized societies show up in the ice cores, and we found no such emissions in the cores from the Ice Age. If Graham's civilization was there, it was on a level of technological advancement comparable to the ancient Egyptians. So, if the lost civilization could figure out all this astronomical information, why couldn't the Egyptians just do it themselves? You know, Occam's razor. All else considered, the argument with least assumptions is probably correct. Graham also went on to point out similarities in the designs and depictions of the Giza pyramids and Angkor Wat in Cambodia to argue that they are both descended from a parent civilization. However, contrary to popular belief, Angkor Wat wasn't an ancient civilization, it was medieval, i.e. thousands of years after the pyramids were built. And like I said, the pre-industrial world was way more interconnected than most people realize. So, it's not much of a stretch, or at least a smaller stretch than a prehistoric civilization, to think a traveler brought the information from Egypt to Cambodia. The last issue I want to touch on is how Graham talks about how archaeology is often too rigid, and the example he gave was the fall of the Clovis first hypothesis. Throughout the latter part of the 20th century, most archaeologists thought the Clovis people were the first to arrive in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. But in the 1980s, some archaeologists had presented evidence that humans were in the Americas thousands of years earlier in places like Monteverde and Chile, but these were met with ridicule by their peers. As more evidence came up and reanalysis confirmed the new claims, in the 1990s and 2000s, more archaeologists abandoned the Clovis first hypothesis, and by the 2010s, Clovis first was thoroughly debunked, and the people who challenged it and were scorned in the 80s were vindicated. And I'll admit that archaeology, like any field of science, is subjected to dogmatism. After all, you have humans studying it, not robots, and this has held science back. But archaeologists have a limited amount of resources to conduct research with, and it would have advanced much more slowly if archaeologists went down a wild goose chase every time a fringe theory came up, because most of the time these lead to dead ends. Lastly, what annoyed me at the end was Graham trying to say, well, at the end of the day, we're all on the same side and that we're trying to get a better understanding of the past, even if we're taking different approaches. But as for me, I hate this kind of sophistry and equivocation, and it's quite reminiscent of trying to put alternative medicine on the same pedestal as medicine. Like Stephen Hawking said, the greatest enemy of knowledge isn't ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge, and the illusion of it is exactly what Graham is pushing.